So it's my great, great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Mabel Wilson. Earned her Master of Architecture from Columbia University's GSAPP and a PhD in American Studies from NYU. Trained in both architecture and American Studies, these two fields inform her scholarship, curatorial projects, artworks, and design projects. And through her interdisciplinary studio, or interdisciplinary practice studio and, unless it's studio ampersand, studio and, Wilson makes visible and legible the ways that anti-Black racism shapes the built environment, along with the ways that Blackness creates spaces of imagination, refusal, and desire. Her research investigates space politics and cultural memory in Black America, race and modern architecture, new technologies, and the social production of space and visual culture in contemporary art, media, and film. So this is going to be very, very rich, I can assure you that. Her practice has been a competition finalist for several important institutions, including Manhattan's African Burial Ground Memorial and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture with Diller's Graffiti on Renfro. More recently, she was a member of the architectural team designing the memorial to enslaved African American laborers at the University of Virginia, about which I believe we will hear her speak this evening. Her monographs include Beginning with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, page 2, with Irene Cheng and Charles Davis III. She co-edited the first ever volume on race and modern architecture, which our third-year students are currently reading. And with Sean Lowry, she co-curated the exhibition Reconstructions, Blackness in America, Blackness and Architecture in America, exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art. There's so much more she's accomplished. I'm going to cut to the chase because we want to hear Mabel. I just want to mention two last things. One, she recently received the 2021 Vincent Scully Prize for her significant contribution to architectural scholarship. And I also just want to say that she's an intellectual and creative force. Welcome, Mabel Wilson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay. I mean, I'm a quiet person, but I can talk pretty loudly. But thank you, Beth, for that really generous introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I've never been to Tucson before, but I will definitely be back. So it's a really, really, really great place. Fascinating landscape, interesting architecture. There's so much to explore here. So you guys are really, 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 really lucky. I got to find out a little bit more from the school, from Hallie, Tabitha, and Alexis. Is that right? Yes. So I got to find out kind of what's going on. And, again, it seems like a very vibrant place. So I just want to thank the school for the invitation, for Beth, for all of the work she did to get me here. I almost didn't come because of, Omicron and COVID, but it was really just great to get out of 17-degree slushy New York City and be somewhere warm. But I apologize for bringing a cold snap because this happens every time I try to go someplace warm. I'm actually going to talk about practice, which I hadn't really done in a long time, and really talk about a body of work. And so I just wanted to talk about, and this might be helpful, I think, to students, is how does your work impact practice and how you think? And all of this stuff, the curatorial, the historical, I mean, it's all packed into the practice. And I'll show you a little bit about how that works. So let me get this moving. So, ooh, funky. It's interesting. The colors are totally washed out. Hopefully this isn't going to be the resolution for everything because you really can't see all of this. But I began Studio And in 2007. And part of the reason, it is called Studio And is because I was thinking very much about the many disciplines that I work within. So it's and other disciplines. But I'm also deeply invested in collaboration, right? And so it really is about and others. It's about the dialogue and really the productive work that can come out of that. And I have to say, really, even pedagogically, I often insist that my students work in teams and pairs because I actually think nobody ever sits alone and makes by themselves. It's not possible. I have met Glenn Murcutt, who really has pretty much made a career working, but he still has to work with, the people who are building. Like it's architectural practice is always a practice of communication. That's what you do. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not about individual genius. It's really about collaboration. And so, my practice has really navigated between written works, speculative works, built projects occasionally, performances and curatorial projects. And this was an early diagram of a practice, probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And so what you cannot see on the left side are really the more scholarly projects. So Negro Building is in there. And then there's an arc that then comes to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was a competition I worked on, collaborated with Diller Scofidio Renfro, and then that becomes a kind of three-dimensional architectural project. And it was because in this book, I talk about the formation, the beginnings of that history of that institution. But not in this diagram is another arc going back to the two-dimensional, because then we didn't win the competition, although the Washington Post liked our entry. David Adjaye, Phil Freelon, and Max Bond won it. But I was asked by Lonnie Bunch and Kinshasa Conwell to then write a book about it because I understood it as an architect and I understood it as a historian. And so that's what I mean. It's a very transdisciplinary practice, and it tends to go very much back and forth in that way. And so I want to talk about why these methods are important for how I work and how it helps me understand both a kind of legacy of Blackness, anti-Black racism, and race more broadly in what I do. So I would say during both my architectural education at the undergraduate level, where I went to the University of Virginia, and also in graduate school, I went to GSAT with Beth. Beth is actually a classmate. I recognized that in order to really draw Blackness into how I was thinking about architecture and what's called the discourse of architecture, the ideas, but also its practices, but also to make visible this question of anti-Black racism in the built realm, that I really needed to just get out of architecture, cut across the boundaries, right? Transgress its boundaries. And so I turned elsewhere. I started looking at art, literature, Black studies, poetry, critical race theory, critical theory, all of these things were starting to help me situate architecture in a critical way. And I know this is part of the class that Beth is teaching, like that is some of the work that she's really asking you to do. And that's important to do that, to situate your own education, right? And to challenge what you are learning. That is so important. So I would say early on, one of the people who was influential on me was the late novelist Toni Morrison, who's really, she's an amazing writer and thinker. And she really helped provide, even though she's a novelist, she really provided a critical method, and I'll explain exactly what that is, for my practice. And so this is a quote from her essay, Black Matters, and I just crossed out where she says the English language, and I put architectural language, or really it's architectural representation. So my effort to manipulate architectural representation was not to take standard architectural representation and use vernacular to decorate or paint it over, but to carve away its accretions of deceit, blindness, ignorance, paralysis, and sheer malevolence, so that certain kinds of perceptions were not only available, but also inevitable, right? And she's talking about her writing practice. And this is important because, it's a way of beginning to think about the world. Now, this was an image from a painting that I used when I taught an urban, it was a class called Urban Theory, actually to, I think, 4th year BArch students at University of Kentucky. It was either 3rd or 4th year Bachelor of Architecture students. And I've always been fascinated by this painting by Samuel Jennings. It's called Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences, or the Genius of America, Encouraging the Emancipation of the Blacks, and it's from 1792. Now, Morrison kind of writes about paintings like this, but she's thinking about this question through her nonfiction work, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. And through that book, I started to realize it was important to really reckon with the ways that we know the world and our being in the world from the Western perspective, from the West, that is difficult for the African, if not impossible, or the African that is literally blackened, right, racialized in the hold of the slave ship to become Negro, to become black. And, the idea, and this is what Hegel, I have to teach Hegel tomorrow to my doctoral students, but what Hegel writes in the history of philosophy is basically the African can have no historical consciousness. It's not possible to be reflective about time because the African is just in time, right? And so this is the subject formation that the West imagined to be modern. And Blackness is assigned to the past, to the primitive, to the savage, to the not modern. And yet, that dialogue or the dialectic is wholly necessary, as Morrison writes, to give definition and depth to whiteness, which is a metaphor, right? I'm talking about the discourse, the metaphor, the representations in the language, right? And this relegation of being on the threshold of modernity, awaiting development, and that is literally the language of development that we hear applied to the global South, for example, is a misreading of what it means to actually be modern. So the other person really recently that I became interested in was a poet named Nurbasi Philip. She's actually a lawyer, which is interesting. So she does double duty. And she also recognizes the same kind of trap in the way in which the West thinks about itself. And she distrusts these documents of policies and of law and of legal decision. And she's really wary of the language of being and history because it doesn't adequately account for this historical event that she writes a book of poetry about called Zong. And what the Zong was, it was a slave ship, originally Dutch, and it was traveling between, I believe, Gambia and Jamaica with a cargo of enslaved people. And the ship drifted, as it was approaching the Caribbean, it shifted off course and it kind of got lost and it couldn't figure out. And so they were running out of provisions, water, food. And yet, they had hundreds of enslaved bodies essentially to feed. And so it was just like, how much of this cargo are we going to deliver? So they literally just started tossing people overboard, right? Because it was just cargo in their minds. Just threw them, over 200 people were thrown off board. So then they find their way, they go to Jamaica, they offload the cargo that they have, and then they go back to London. Why London? Well, that's because that's where the insurance company was, and they lost cargo. So they filed to the insurance company to be repaid for their lost cargo. So it was a really well-known court case that the British abolitionists knew about and were simply to say, this is, the cruelty and the horror of slavery, to reduce humans to mere lines, right, on a spread, what we call a spreadsheet, on a ledger. And so Nurbasi Phillips is interested in this history, but the only thing that remains is a 2-page document, Gilbert versus Gregson. That's it, 2 pages of this horrific event. That's it. That's all they know. Legal precedent in history. That's it. And it's a very famous case in abolition, the abolition history. And so, she writes of the violence. The language in which those events took place promulgated the non-being of African peoples. And I distrust its order, which hides disorder, its logic, hiding the illogic, and its rationality, which is simultaneously irrational, right? And so she's looking at, this dialectic of reason, right? The rational is exactly dependent on the irrational for its function. And in the poetry Zong, she takes that document and she does what Morrison does. She carves away at it. She takes the language and she tries to tell a story. She says, I try to tell a story by not telling the story. And she wants to know, well, who were these 200 plus people? But it's a beautiful, beautiful book of poetry, but it's very spatial about how she uses the page, how she uses the graphics. Toward the end, You can't even see the words. You can't really read. You know, there's a kind of immersion of the text by the last set of poems. So it's very interesting how she works on that. And so it, you know, it helps me think about, like, well, what is modern architecture if not order, logic, and rationality, right? You know, that is the modern canon from certainly the 19th century, 20th century to today. But can architecture be hiding disorder, illogic, and irrationality, which in fact is what people call the double bind of modernity? And we see this even in this painting, right? Of here is liberty, you know, dressed in white. She's the muse. She's Cleo. She has what's called a Phrygian cap, which means that she is actually freed. She is freedom. And you know, she's clearly in the space of Western knowledge. Her hand is actually on a book of agriculture and philosophy, right? So sowing the body and also feeding the body and feeding the mind. But here's cartography, music, painting, antiquity, heraldry. You know, this could be architecture, mechanics, astronomy, right? And note the organized space of the grid. Here, her chain, so we know that she's free. And so this is the realm, right, of neoclassicism in architecture. And this was actually painted for what was called the Library Company in Philadelphia, which was the first kind of public library in the country founded by Ben Franklin. People paid into it, and they ordered books. And these books were actually essential to the writing of the Declaration of Independence and also the various constitutional congresses, actually. So it still exists today as a research library. And you could see this painting. So Jennings was he was a painter, and he sends this over, and this guy here is Granville Sharp, and he was an abolitionist. And so it's apparently an allegory about not only freeing the enslaved Africans, even though probably some of these people could have been from the Caribbean, they could have been in the Americas, and then the ships are going to take them back to Africa, essentially, right? So that's a kind of allegorical space in that. So, you know, what I'm interested in and have been for a number of years is that architecture, right? Its representational tools, how it writes history, its, you know, entanglements with state power and capitalism, its aesthetics and its technologies are knotted within this double bind of racialized thinking, representation, and practices, right? And that's really, you know, this is pretty much what this book does. I mean, it takes this on and it goes through a history of architecture to show how racialisms or racial thinking has been part and parcel of how architecture has thought itself, right? So in response to that double bind, really since I left my graduate degree, my MArch, I've engaged in what I call a Black study that allows me to make visible not only my own history, and you'll see this in a moment, but bring Black cultural practices and sensibilities into the making of the built world. And so it is really an ethos of dialogue and collaboration that frames my practice as I've explored recurring themes of home places, what I call rememory, mobility, and the unbuilding of race. And this is just, I love the work of Carrie Mae Weems, and so I just wrote a very, very long essay on her work. But the way in which she's engaging in these institutions of the West, and I think next week you talk about institutions, you know, and the museum is very much one of them, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. So home places. So in my last studio in my MArch at GSAP is Studio 6. And it was a mix of both post-professionals and MArch students. And I was in the studio taught by Stan Allen, who left Columbia, became the dean at Princeton. And so he tasked us to unpack the single-family American suburban house through techniques of collage. That was going to be our method. And so I chose to unpack, and I was very curious about this kind of latent Blackness and the invisible forces of anti-Black racism, you know, that make that single-family American house, right? And this is the house that I grew up in, right? It is what my friend Diane Harris calls a little white house in coastal New Jersey in the 1960s. And in fact, my dad was an engineer and he designed this house and it was built. So yeah, so I had this very personal history with this. And you know, when you do this, is, you know, this last studio is kind of like what you guys call capstone. And so I took something quite personal and just decided, all right, let's go for it. And it's still a thread in my work today. So my entree into the world of language and ideas was actually through this book called Before We Read. Yes, in fact, I am that old. And so this was actually rendered in the 50s, so I'm not that old. But this was the version that I had. And it was what was called a primer. So it was like the Dick and Jane primer, C. Scott, C. Spot Run, etc. But what I think is interesting about this, like look at this. Like look at what Jane is doing, right? And the ways in which that image reinforces the gendered role of the woman, right, in the kitchen, right, in that space, that threshold. I don't know what Sally's doing. She's not in there yet. But, no, Dick, he's mimicking dad, right? So this is telling us how these gender roles, right, are constructed in this space, and this is the context of that, literally the little white house, and here are the kids in the car, right? So it's clearly the, suburban America. But this common edition of the Dick and Jane primer reinforces that before we read words, we learned the world through images, right? Because there were no words in this book. It was all about the image. And clearly, neither the words or the images are neutral. So for my Studio 6 project, I unpacked Toni Morrison's epigraph to her novel, The Bluest Eye, where she carves away at this type of primer. So note on the left, the first paragraph introduces the single family house of the suburb. Here it is, the house. Its colors are generic. Its entry and family resides there. And notice how it teaches us reading through forms of identification, types of sociality, what is beautiful, what is aesthetically pleasing. Various emotive, affective responses are embedded in this text that kids would read. So this makes learning to read the world possible. But there's stuff clearly embedded in it, along with it. Now, in the second paragraph, Morrison takes out the rules of grammar, right? So she takes out capitalization and punctuation. So we can read the words, but we don't quite know where meaning stops. But the words, right, still have, some sense of meaning, even though it's a little bit elusive. Now, the third paragraph, Morrison carves out even more. And this is what I did. I just looked at it as an architect, like, well, what is she doing with space, right? She just compresses everything so that you can't see the spaces between the words. Now, what does that do? It's merely a string of letters, right? So you can't really detect the words. And it makes not only reading difficult, but breathing difficult, right? There's no breath, there's no body in that, right? And in the end, the right side, it's just madness. But that is the space of the little girl, right, in The Bluest Eye. She's a young black girl, Pecola, who lives among untold violence and suffering. However, she has this beautiful little blonde doll with blue eyes. She's, learning of the world through the Dick and Jane. And she just thinks, if I have blue eyes, I'll be beautiful and hence happy. And insanity in the book becomes her refuge, right? So this, to me, was a very architectural move that Morrison makes. And this is her carving away, right? So I picked a site, Levittown, and there's Levittown, New Jersey, Levittown, Pennsylvania, Levittown, Long Island, the original ones. This is the image. And it really has a long history of white settler colonialism that really forged whiteness as property, as Cheryl Harris writes. Restrictive covenants and bank lending practices of redline ensured that America's pre- and post-war federally financed suburbs would stay white and heteronormative. There were all kinds of covenants about Jews moving in, blacks moving in, Mexicans, China. It was just like, no, this is the world we want. So hopefully I can get this to play.
Place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
Right. So that was a documentary. It was almost like almost an anthropological ethnographic documentary. You can find it on YouTube, and it's absolutely fascinating, right? So, I started looking at the plans and sections of the house. an adapted Morrison strategy of carving away to misread the spatial logics of that Levittown house through its drawing, through its modes of representation. You know, Black artists have a long history of working, so I was seeing the house as a found object. So, you know, Black artists have a whole history along that lineage of assemblage artists, right? And I turned toward the assemblage art of Betty Saar, whose liberation of Aunt Jemima became a generative figure in the project. So the drawings, and you could see the figure from that, literally that collage, which then becomes part of the kitchen because she's hiding in the cabinet, but she's also this kind of figure of domestic labor, right? So the drawings dissected the rooms to find hidden below the stairs and between the walls, inside the cabinets, like Aunt Jemima. She's syrup, she's pancake mix, right? Around the plumbing, under the floors, in the basement, and in the attic, representations of Blackness, right? A mask, Aunt Jemima, and a charm. And through this process of reading these drawings, I started to find these spaces, right? And so I read the suburb into the city, where I drew on the famous suburban houses that were built in the South Bronx, Charlotte Gardens. And in this process of reading and misreading, I discovered a house for Grigri. That's what the project was called. A talisman for domestic rituals and a container of the everyday practices of Black life. So for these early explorations of Blackness, I also drew on the familiar work of Los Angeles artist John Outerbridge, who passed away a little over a year ago. And so you can see some of his work here. There's the Broken Dance in MoMA, and another piece, Let Us Tie Down Loose Ends. So Outerbridge, who is my mother's brother, grew up in the Jim Crow South. The house that I knew of the family was this white house, though it's a double shotgun, and this was in Greenville, North Carolina. My mother and uncle grew up actually in a similar house nearby, but this is the home place that I remember. And so my mother migrated with my father to New Jersey in the 1950s, and shortly thereafter, my uncle migrated to Chicago and then out to Los Angeles, as did many of their generation who were fleeing the oppressive racism of Southern segregation at the turn of the civil rights movement. And as they moved, they brought with them rich culture of making things, of making a way out of no way. And, you know, I've written that home places can travel like people in packages. Any place you collect objects of remembrance, model ships and family photographs, or practice the rituals of everyday life, like cooking fried fish from old recipes or making lye soap, all of these things can serve as a spiritual entree back to one's home place. So my Uncle Johnny eventually settled in Los Angeles in the 1960s. And he joined a cadre of artists that included Betty Saar, David Hammond, Noah Purifoy, and many others who made revolutionary artistic statements from the detritus of the Watts Rebellion in 1965. And this is a piece that he did around that time called Traditional Hang-Up. So he worked a lot with metals, with like little found objects that are precious and domestic. So he has an amazing kind of sensibility. Here are a couple of more. He built full-scale installations, you know, in a series called The Aesthetics of Urban Blight, right? Thinking blight could be beautiful. What is beautiful? You know, this was also Noah Purifoy's philosophy, right? I think you guys read Lisa Uden, right? This is exactly that moment. And, you know, he, you know, is thinking about these kind of intricate objects, right, in these kind of large-scale industrial landscapes. So with architect-photographer Peter Tolkien, he has a practice called Tolo in Los Angeles, but he's also an amazing photographer. He was also a classmate from Columbia. We spent the day talking with my Uncle John. And we were interested in how he not only made art out of everyday life, but also architecture. He was a painter, he was a photographer, he could play blues on a flute. And he found art in many things, including the culinary. And so we shared the sweetness of grilled catfish while the soulful strains of John Coltrane drifted through his studio in South Central Los Angeles. That's why the piece is called Catfish and Coltrane. So this is one of the photographs Peter took from outside. You could see the A on the door, very enigmatic, but it's actually for artists. The door on the right is for vintage VWs, which my uncle worked on. Again, for him, that was an artistic practice of restoring these cars. The colors of red, blue, and yellow actually mark hazardous chemicals for making art inside. Here's the interior of that. So you see doors with holes, artwork on white walls, windows right up at the top, framed by the aesthetics of urban blight. So it's not only in his art, but he's working this way with these kind of cortin panels in the interior. The fragments of rag on one side, right, on that tall crossed piece, right? On the other side is actually a towel bar with the same kind of rag, right? So art and domestic life intermingle. And I'll show you what I mean. So screws as buttons on In Search of the Missing Mule in 1993, and you can see that work in the corner. That's oops. Yeah, you can see that piece in the corner. This is a detail. And then in the kitchen, a similar kind of aesthetic of the screws and this kind of different rhythm, 3 versus 2, these found countertops meeting, right? So there's a kind of language of how you make everyday life in his space. And it's a deep, deep space. It's cosmological, like Sun Ra. And really, this is the incredible legacy of my Uncle John and the way in which he worked with found materials. So over that long arc of the Great Migration, thousands of Black Americans, like my parents and my Uncle Johnny, moved to and transformed the places to which they arrived. So I worked on a full-scale installation called A Way Station that examines the architectural spaces of urban migration. In 1995, I started a practice called, it was called KWA. It was actually a play on NWA at the time. And my partner in that, again, was a classmate. He was an undergraduate classmate, Paul Kariuk, who has an amazing practice actually in Ottawa. He teaches at Carleton. So, and actually this piece, let's just say it's in a museum collection. It's going to be shown sometime soon. We're working on this now. But it was a full-scale installation looking at the space of urban migration, right? And so we started to think about the role of the migration narrative, which is actually a genre in literature. And the different stories, right, that migrants tell. My parents had stories. Paul's family had stories of migrating from France to New York. And so we started to think about, like, what is that space of arrival, right, of the person in migration. And so we started to imagine a kitchen and a bedroom, a living room and a bathroom laid out. And it's typically separated, not always, but typically segregated. But in those who are in the midst of migration, that can be condensed into the same space, and a kind of improvised domesticity emerges. So on the right, you see all of those drawings collapsed onto one. And then those red lines are like section cuts that cut apart the density of that room. The room is 9 by 16, or 9 by 15, sorry. So this gives you a sense of, it's a technique thinking about assemblage art, of found objects, and it really collapses these dense amalgam of objects that are brought in transition with the materiality of wallpaper and plywood, of like literally how the room is constructed, right? But it's furniture and clothing and sentimental objects that are packed in with newly acquired objects of consumer culture, right? So this is some of the fabrication process. We worked with a good friend, Yusuke Abuchi, who's now at the University of Tokyo. He ran the, what's the DRL? Digital Research Lab at the AA for a number of years. And now he has his own lab actually at University of Tokyo, and he's doing stunningly beautiful work. So that's Paul in the white hat. And we fabricated this thing over several months. And this is some of what it looks like, right? And so for some of these way stations, it could be a hotel room, the residence of a friend or family, a refugee center, is a point of transition. That's what was important, right? And it could be that you're thinking about a return, or it could be that you're thinking about an adaptation to this new place. And so that things and memories packed together to form a dense milieu where the everyday rituals of life unfold, right? And so we start to think about how you would slice through these objects, and so that they either become familiar or enigmatic, just like right? The place that you've just arrived to. It has 15 towers that can be unpacked according to the space it inhabits and can adapt, like the migrant, to the unpredictable circumstances of sight. And so here it is in storefront for art and architecture. um, the drawings were shown on what we call the drawing table. It was a wood insert. It was fabricated out of metal pieces. And inside each tower are light bulbs that illuminate. And so you can start to see, these sort of objects. This is from the outside of storefront, right? And the ways in which you would see and walk in to the space. And it really creates a space within a space, right? And as you're moving, you hear recorded narratives. So, and it documents the project's journey. So in New York, we did a series of interviews describing, these spaces. So here it is again in New York. You could hear a migration narrative of Jean Urique, who was fleeing the Duvaliers in Haiti, literally left overnight, arrived in New York in shorts, and it was snowing. We spoke with Alan, who was an undocumented Filipino woman, about her aspirations. We actually interviewed my father because he moved to this region, about why he left the segregated South to seek opportunities for his family. We talked to a woman who left Hungary just before the Nazis took over, and how she moved to New York. So there were all of these ranges of stories, migration narratives that you were hearing. Here's the away station in San Francisco. So again, I mean, it can be unpacked in different ways. And for that one, we talked to a Colombian woman who migrated for Peru, who was seeking opportunities and independence for herself and her family. We interviewed this amazing conversation with an elderly Chinese American man and his daughter, who left his homeland at age 4 and arrived in San Francisco in 1915. So like he was well into his late 90s when we spoke with him, but he remembered crystal clear what it meant to arrive at that city at that time. And in LA, we also showed this in LA and a few other places, but my Uncle Johnny was one of the people that we interviewed for that, about his migration story. And so you see there's a door, there's a medicine cabinet, drawers that can be pulled out. It's meant to be very tactile. And so in these interim homes, these way stations, people establish domiciles that are situated between the memories of the homelands from which they have recently fled and their imaginings and desires of the places they aspire to be. And that was very important to sort of capture that space. So another theme is remembering. How do you build spaces for remembering? Suturing together the past from the archives and sites of slavery, which still bear the traces of physical, epistemic, and ontological violence of enslavement. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means. My colleague Saidiya Hartman, in her essay Venus in Two Acts, sort of asked this question about, how do I tell a story of two girls capable of retrieving what remains dormant? And for her, it was intent on achieving an impossible goal. This is what she writes toward the end: redressing the violence that produced the numbers, ciphers, fragments of discourse, which is as close as we can come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved. Realizing it is impossible because there isn't the evidence of that. So when it opened in 1826, the University of Virginia's 10 pavilions housed faculty and family. You may know this site from your history classes. The lawn rooms boarded 125 white male students, no women, no folks of color, and that verdant swath of the beautiful lawn that terraced up to the rotunda, right? Which is, this kind of Enlightenment, ideal form, Platonic form of the library, right, of knowledge. In his plans for an academical village, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, second governor of Virginia, third president of the United States, he was a surveyor, a lawyer, a plantation owner, and owner of 600 enslaved people over the course of his life, wrote in a letter that he wanted to bring in a university together in an environment designed to be conducive to what he said was health, to study, to manners, morals, and order. So here's that word order again, right? Jefferson, the architect. But notice, down here in the corner. When I was an architecture student at UVA, what was silent in that official history and narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 65 was a mention of the enslaved people, roughly 150 at one time, of the men, women, and children who built and maintained the university. And we see here an enslaved woman at the end of Pavilion 9 taking care of the white child of one of the professors. That history was hiding in plain sight for 155 years. So in 2016, I joined with architects Mi-Jin Yoon and Eric Howler. Mi-Jin's the dean now of Cornell. Activist, landscape architect Greg Bleem, who's in the middle, all the way to the right, is an activist and conflict mediator, UVA professor Frank Dukes. And we won the competition to design what was called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, which opened in the spring of 2020. And seen here at Montpelier, which is the plantation that James Madison owned, is the Brooklyn-based artist Eto Ochatigbe, and he joined our team a year later. So for over 6 months, we engaged multiple communities from inside the university and inside the city of Charlottesville. What we heard was that the memorial needed to tell the unvarnished truth about the past to have any kind of legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together to learn and reflect about this very difficult history, and that it needed to express dualities. People were like, you can't just show pain and suffering, but you also have to show the dignity and the humanity of those who were enslaved. But we also heard that it had to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of the commemorative landscape was incomplete, right? There was still work to be done, because some people say you build a monument, you forget. And they were worried that that was going to be the case here. And it was important for us, this is a quote that we got from a survey that we sent out, was to convey that material presence of Black lives at UVA, right? And this is what this response says about how proud they are of looking at every brick. And literally in some of the bricks, the original bricks, you can see the thumbprints of the enslaved people that made the bricks. They were usually young boys who were doing this work. And if you actually go to Monticello, they are still, it's still evident on the walls, right, of the home, of the plantation home. Along with collecting aspirations and hearing about these meanings and experiences and the stories that needed to be told, we also did extensive researches into Black traditions and spaces of gathering. As part of the design process, we looked for cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into a design. So for example, we became interested in something called a ring shout, which is being performed here. And it's a low country, so that's like the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, where the performers move in a circle, right? And the rhythms and the movement connect very directly to Western African practices. And so we became very interested in the circular forms, right? That can be symbolic of the ring shout, but even a broken shackle, right, as a form. So here you see the memorial in this corner. There's the rotunda up here. And so we decided to kind of cite it in dialogue with the rotunda. We actually picked the site. University didn't know what it wanted. It didn't know how much it was going to spend. It was either the project of your dreams or your worst nightmare, and it was a little bit of both. And so the rotunda, because it terraced up, it was built to sit at a ridgeline, the highest point. And that careful section allowed for 2-story pavilions on the lawn side, which we saw in that engraving. But actually, because it slopes down, you get 3 stories on the back side of those pavilions. Now on the back side, those were walkout level basements. And that's where the enslaved lived, and that's where they worked. And so what now look like these beautiful gardens in the back, those were work yards, right? They were hidden from sight. This is where the enslaved, these are the famous 1 brick thick serpentine walls. They're much taller than they are today. And this is where the enslaved labored. They chopped wood, they hauled water, they slaughtered animals for the smokehouse, they washed clothing. And Jefferson understood very well, if you read Notes on the State of Virginia, that slavery was abhorrent, right? but he used the architectural section to hide it. He does exactly the same thing at Monticello, right? But by contrast, what we wanted to do was to open up, right, a space, to reveal and to invite. And we utilized the landscape and the section to actually do that, to make an open, like bowl-like figure. And it matches the radius of the rotunda. The rotunda is 80 feet, our memorial is 80 feet. So it's in direct dialogue with it. So here you can see it from an aerial. And it's actually oriented northward toward the direction of Frida. And that path you see to the left lays out one step for each of the 48 years that enslaved people lived and worked at UVA. These are the elements. It's a series of nested rings. It's actually fabricated in Virginia Miss granite from a nearby quarry on Culpeper. And it's a beautiful granite because it has a range. If it's polished, it could be very black, and it can also go to a very light gray. And so we, again, wanted a material that was very malleable. Even though it's granite and it's hard, it actually has a range of textures, right, for marking the surface. The center holds a gathering space. Then it's inscribed by an inner ring that holds a timeline of historical events. The next layer out is a concave surface of remembrance of names, and that outer convex surface creates a canvas for expression. And each of these rings speaks to a different layer of history, meaning, and interpretation. But to the work, we had to develop layers of history to this memorial. And we work with an amazing group of historians who are doing work. And I should say that this memorial came not from the university, from students who held the university accountable for about 10 years. Like, you need to tell this story. This isn't adequate. You need to do it. There were sit-ins in the president's office, and the students made the university accountable to tell the truth of its own history. So students have power. You got to exercise it. And so, you know, the archival work of the historians really gave us amazing history, like from this ledger, right? Extra hands at Christmas, paid $2.50. The university primarily rented people. The enslaved were owned by the professors or the people who ran the hotels, which where the students ate. And then the enslaved, who the hotel owners owned, cleaned the student rooms. But we had to name names. To tell the story of the enslaved community meant we had to engage with those awful ledgers and personal letters of slave owners. And it was an archive of daily life, but laced with silence and violence. So historians estimate that there were about 4,000 people over that period, from 1817 to 65. But we know very little details about the lives of the men, women, and children. But we recognize all of them with something we call memory marks that are arrayed across that inner arc of the memorial. So for 3,111 persons to be exact, the archives don't yield a first name or last name, right? And they're just, the memory mark stands for them. As the spreadsheet on the right shows, this is a list, we found records for 889 people. Of those 889 references, we know mostly the first name of 577 community members, mostly from letters, from ledgers. For a handful of people, we know first names and last names, which is very unusual. Isabella Gibbons, Sally Cottrell, Thrimston Hearn, Henry Martin. We have a first name and last name. But we knew 311 recorded people, like 3 extra hands. We used kinship relationships and occupations to remember who they were. So this is what you see when you walk into the memorial. You walk into a kind of genealogical cloud of names, marks, and relationships, right? And so this was very carefully spread out according to the scale of the panels. And it's quasi historical timeline of it, but not exactly, because it's very difficult. This is very limited knowledge of when people were there. And, you know, you end up with records of like 40 people named Sam, but Sam who when you don't have a last name? So the list of names are traditional features of Western memorials. But given this archive, right, we had to reimagine social relations and rehumanize the experience of the enslaved. As a result, visitors engage Henry, Isabella, Jack, Jane, Roberti, and Randall as families of sisters and grandmothers and mothers, uncles, fathers, and friends, and as workers who took pride in their work as woodcutters and stonemasons, laundresses, servants, and fiddlers. Carved into the granite are these 4,000 memory marks, and they speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us, right? So you can see the ones that are marked without the names. That's because we don't know who they are, but somehow their presence was marked. So across from that, which is where these people are looking, is a timeline, right? And there's a very shallow water table, and this timeline tells a history of the enslaved, right? And so there are 70 historical entries inscribed into the water table that begin with the arrival of enslaved peoples to Virginia in 1619. And it ends with the passing of someone named Isabella Gibbons in 1890. The timeline covers the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers with Thomas Jefferson to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817. And so it covers a history of transactions, work, and violence. We have the steady stream of shallow water that you could see to the right that washes over this entire arc of the timeline, and this references libation rituals and also the currents of rivers that would have taken people to freedom, if they had escaped. And there were. The timeline actually does recount when people run away. Not often, but it did happen. And so here you see, right, the kind of language that we had to develop to describe this history. I mean, it's dry but deep and informative. Thrimston Hearn, quote from a letter, "A tolerable good stone cutter. He does stonework at UVA, including completing the rotunda steps," right? So he was a very skilled craftsman. 1850, 3 students attack a 12-year-old enslaved girl in a field near UVA. The students are expelled. And actually, the original was that the students raped a 12-year-old girl. But we had to take that out because from the education department, we heard young children are going to be there, visit the site. But this gives you a sense of that range of what this history tells us. So Isabella Gibbons was a teacher and founder of the Freedmen's School, and is the only member of the enslaved community in which the archives have yielded, we know her first and last name, a date of death, 1890. We have a photograph, and we actually have a brief written record from the Freedmen's Record of her experiences of being enslaved. And this is what she writes. She's a witness for her community. Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuff, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by these horrible cruelty, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or never will, end quote. So her remembrance concludes the historical timeline. And she wrote that because she was seeing how history was going to be rewritten, that slavery was benevolent and people were taken care of. And so she's saying, no, this is what we remember from slavery. It's the violence that is required to keep someone in that condition. This is an image of Isabella. So Eto Otatidbe, the artist who joined our team, became interested in layering all of this historical information about people like Gibbons. He was also interested in the ways in which tombstones like this one at the Daughter of Zion African American Burial Ground, was bush hammered in a way. So again, like the texture of the stone. We're looking here at a close-up of the photograph of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. Now, the original photograph, interesting enough, is in the archives of the Boston Public Library. And this could be because she was enslaved by UVA mathematics professor William Barton Rogers, who would leave Boston. She would stay, but he would leave Boston. And he would leave UVA, go to Boston, and actually be the founder of MIT, right? But while he was at UVA, he owned people because that's what you did for labor. So to realize this image of Gibbons' eyes, Eto, working with our design team, developed a very unique process. And this is also with an amazing fabricator we had, Cora Stone in Madison, Wisconsin. And so it was a unique process, customized software. And so the data was translated from the photograph to a virtual model. Then they developed a machine toolpath that generated a virtual surface. And this was overlaid onto a digital model of the memorial's curved surface. Now, all of this was done digitally, working in remote teams because this is COVID that eventually hit. And this included the Virginia's Office of the Architects and our amazing contractor team, Henry. And all of this was coordinated before the stone was actually cut and fabricated. in Madison, Wisconsin. So quarried in Culpeper, shipped to Madison, and then brought back and installed, right? And so this is what this actually, oh, great. This is what it looks like, right? So you can you see the eyes of Isabella Gibbons. That vertical creates a lenticular image. So sometimes you see her, sometimes you don't, depending on where your body is, what the light is in the sky. So she's this very interesting ghostly figure, right, of this. I call her the witness and the watcher. And she's symbolic of all the enslaved and their descendants who continue to witness the social transformations of the fight against anti-Black racism. Now, the day after, we didn't dedicate it, the memorial in April of 2020 because of COVID. It was like 1 month into COVID. But the construction fence was removed from UVA, from the site in June of 2020. And UVA's medical schools group, White Coats for Black Lives, organized a protest, literally within 3 days after the fence came down. Not dedicated, it's just there. The group took the knee for 8 minutes and 49 seconds in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder that the violence and injustices persist even in the wake of slavery. The memorial to enslaved laborers came into fruition through a collective desire to face the past. Another community made visible through this collective reckoning was a group who claimed kinship with the enslaved community, and here we see a reunion of the descendants with their ancestors who lived, worked, and died on the grounds of UVA. And in fact, the memorial, those memory marks are designed so that you could still carve names. And actually, a group of descendants from Thrift and Hearn, when he heard about it, they said, wait, that's our great-great-great-grandfather. So their names were in January, a year ago, January, the names of those who were enslaved of that family were inscribed into the memorial. So that connection between descendants and ancestors, those Black neighborhoods and communities in Charlottesville and the university, is a beginning, not only of remembrance, but also of accountability to reckon with the truth, including the horrible cruelties as the given quotes on the timeline described. So I just want to talk about two more things. Mobility. So that question of movement and migration also means that Black people have taken to the streets, right? This project, Marching On, Politics of Performance, explores these hidden histories of marching, its driving forces, and its organized forms of performance. It was a piece commissioned by Storefront for Art and Architecture in 2017, and I worked in collaboration with my GSEP colleague and an amazing architect, Brian E. Roberts. And so it was a research project, performance, and an exhibition that explored this crucial act of public engagement, both of cultural expression, but also political resistance. Now, our collaborators were an amazing group of youth performers. They call themselves the Marching Cobras of New York City. They're Harlem-based, but they have people from Brooklyn, some in Connecticut. They're both a drum line and a dance line. And they continue this tradition of marching in the streets, and they draw heavily from the theatrical flair of historically Black colleges, HBCUs, alongside the beats and choreography of hip hop. So they're very, very interesting group. So we worked with them on developing a performance. So with the Cobras, we discussed the history of performance, like the history of marching, what that meant. And they really didn't know much about their own art form. So they were really intrigued, and I'll explain why. They asked difficult questions, right? What is lynching, for instance? And with us, they shared their stories about why they joined the Cobras, with many starting as early as 6, staying to their early 20s. And for many, we learned that the Cobras was a creative medium that challenged the criminalization of Black youth in public space. And the choreographer and founding director, Terrell Stowers, the choreographer, Kevin, were also sort of a part of this work. And we showed them the history of the Silent March, which is on the left, against racial violence. This was organized against lynching in 1917 by W.B. Du Bois. This marched down, thousands of people marched down Fifth Avenue silently. In this cadence, the women wore white, the children wore white, and then the men who also marched together, right? But there was also, a couple of years later, the Harlem Hellfighters in 1919 was a unit that fought in World War I alongside French troops because American troops refused their aid. And there were talented musicians in this unit, the Hellfighters, that brought jazz to Europe. That's how Europe learned about jazz. And when they returned home to a country who still saw them as less than human, they nonetheless in New York had this amazing parade through the city down Fifth Avenue, where millions literally of people came out to see them. We showed them how Black people took the streets to be in public, an implicit protest against white supremacy and anti-Black racism, right? Marching against civil rights. We talked about the exuberance of drum lines and HBCUs, right? And the costumes and the capes. And so, this was a kind of history lesson of their own medium, right? And here they are. And we came up with a performance that had tight linear formations in the beginning, that was about the history of the performance. And then, this is something they hadn't really done. And then it helped them delve into the history of this medium and the nature of political protest. We worked with them on costumes. The dancers wore white, symbolic of the Silent March. The drummers, this is Nija being fitted by Bryony. They wore olive green like the Hellfighters, right? And we did this performance as part of Performa, which is a biannual performance occurrence in the city. And we did it in Marcus Garvey Park in the middle of Harlem. And there's a long-standing institution of a drum circle there for decades, actually. But because of rapid gentrification, the noise complaints have come. And so we wanted to kind of bring attention to this kind of history of being in public, of performing in public, drumming in public, and to claim public space, right, in this clearly transitioning and contentious site, right? And so we presented Marching On in November of 2017. And actually it was great because David Byrne, who's obsessed with marching bands, for example, showed up. So we did about 6 performances over a Saturday and a Sunday. So hopefully this will play. I'm just going to show a clip from it, but you'll get the sense of what this was. That should give you a sense of it. And the capes, you can see it's white and olive on one side, but then it flips, and these are the cobra colors on the other, and then they sort of go into their choreography. So it's sort of stitching this history together with their own practices and sensibilities. And so 4 months after the live performance, we did this installation at Storefront for Art and Architecture, And I should say that that pattern, this is something that Bryony is really interested in, we took from the pavement markers in Marcus Garvey Park, and we were interested in the ways in which camouflage, that marching is often a kind of camouflage for political action, a way of being in public and challenging, ideas about who should and could be in public. So that's why we had this kind of like crazy camouflage pattern. And so the exhibition really shows a lot of the historical material that we researched that we did. We included the amazing artist Jenica Henselman, who did these great portraits of the costume cobras in the park, which drew out the unique character of each of the performers, that celebrated their talent and their aspirations. And then when the show opened, the Cobras performed to a rousing crowd of over 100 on the Lower East Side's very narrow Kenmare Street, in front of storefront. The dancers and Cobras and drummers performed without a permit. Why? Because once again, rules about noise and resistance to these kind of sounds. But we took to the streets anyway, made noise, black and proud. So lastly, this question maybe of unbuilding, right? So as Beth mentioned, last year, it was literally installing around this time, I co-curated a show, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It's co-curated with Sean Anderson, along with our curatorial assistants, Ariel Dion Krosnick and Anna Burkhardt. So because Reconstructions explores Blackness and anti-Black racism, its curatorial ethic not only challenged disciplinary practices, but institutional history, which is a whole other story about MoMA, which was part of the impetus for the show. And so it's important to understand how anti-Black racism impacts the environment, right, and shapes the built environment. And this is an HOLC map of Queens in the 1930s. And these maps were actually evaluating property. Red meant grade D, undesirable, do not give loan. Blue was grade A. Green was grade A, sorry. I think it's green that's grade A, yeah, and that's good. And notice green is never near red, always mediated by yellow and blue. And so, this really, inscribes historically poverty into these very neighborhoods. So this is in this book. It's the end flaps. It's what you would see in the front of the book and the back of the book. So that's the front. This is the back. And so these are maps Studio M actually produced. This shows a COVID map from July of 2020, or 2019 rather, and the concentration in that red area of COVID deaths, right? So it shows you how the entrenchment of poverty in that area for 70 years plus, still is impacting those who live within those communities, right? And so this was part of what the project addressed, was that kind of entrenched anti-Black racism. But we were also interested in the ways in which, amongst that degradation, Black folks still found and made spaces of beauty, dignity, and joy, right? We were thinking, sorry, this is hard to see, about the all-Black towns that emerged after the Civil War around the country and what they meant. And we commissioned 11 architects, designers, and artists to create projects that explored these issues around the US. And this is kind of what we gave them. One column was really about scales and types: the body, the kitchen, the house, the neighborhood, the community, the school. We asked everybody to pick 2 scale types. We asked them to pick 2 spaces of remembrance just to start a conversation. Remembrance, spaces of cultivation, spaces of knowledge, spaces of refusal, spaces of grief. So all of those things could be. And then we had the sites: New York City, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Nashville, Syracuse, Oakland, Kinloch, Missouri, which is near St. Louis, Atlanta, and Miami, right? And so those were the sites where the commission work happened. And this is a clip from the teaser.
It has been really hard for brown and Black people to imagine a future in this country.
It's been a real challenge because Black people in America are not given the space to even just be.
in order then to think about possible futures, somehow we have to reimagine ourselves in new places and then find ways to get there.
We're not just interrogating America's history with Blackness, we're interrogating architecture's history with Blackness.
Right. And so this was some of the show. We had to put together a huge advisory group because the archives of MoMA were bereft of material that would be useful a show like this, and MoMA's shows are always archival. And they were immensely helpful. Some of their work is actually in the field guide. We don't call it a catalog, we call it a field guide. And so this is Mario Gooden's Space of Refusal, his protest machine around Nashville, which is a really fascinating project. So there's a series of works up in, the piece on the ceiling is Felicia Davis. Her site was Pittsburgh, the Hill District. This was fabricating networks and the ways in which, the connections between people stayed intact, even though urban renewal was ripping the city apart. To the left is Amanda Williams. We're not down there, we're over here. And on the screen is an artist, David Hart, who did a beautiful meditation on Watts, on the exactitude of science. This is Amanda's piece, We're Not Down Here, over here, Kinloch, Missouri, about migration, about urban renewal, the town of Kinloch, which was an all-Black town, the genius of the Black inventor and how that was important, but oftentimes ignored. Lake Jayufus, amazing artist. Frozen Neighborhoods, a kind of Afrofuturistic Crown Heights, Brooklyn, amazing video piece that he did. Sekou Cook's We Out Here, about the rebuilding of Syracuse, and the ways in which the Freeway 81, which apparently is now coming down, tore through Black communities, and then the public housing aftermath was an absolute failure. So thinking about what is possible in such acts, in the wake of such acts of violence. Jermaine Barnes, Spectrum, thinking about the spectrum of Blackness in a place like Miami, where you have people literally coming from South America, the Caribbean, from all across America, and thinking about what are those spaces where Blackness is really a spectrum, using things like the kitchen and the spice, to quote a Mark, Dominican, Jamaican, African American culture and identity. This is Walter Hood's Tower of Power, about Oakland, using the Black Panthers' 10 points, and what if these 10 points were actually programs for towers. And Emmanuel Atmasu's Immeasurability. And actually this is really about the diaspora, because he's Ethiopian American, thinking about, what does it mean, again, to come from Africa, to cross that divide literally in the middle of the ocean, to become Black again, right? That migration, that middle passage. And then the ways in which the space of Atlanta, Black youth find spaces of social life in that. That's not measurable, that can't be quantified, and thus devalued. And the group of 10 of them actually formed a collective, a nonprofit, the Black Reconstruction Collective. They wrote a manifesting statement that actually covered the name of the gallery, which is named after Philip Johnson, which was a very controversial gallery. Naming of that gallery given the context of the show. So this is their manifesting statement. It's a 10 by 10 foot, and it commits to, quote, continuing this work of reconstruction in Black America. And it was an incredible show. It was up much too short, 3 months, but everybody turned out, and it was an incredibly busy, fruitful show. There's actually a online class on Coursera, which has really been very popular and very successful. That's been a part of it. But we really feel that the fact that there is now this nonprofit after the show, just like the Descendants at UVA, is incredibly important. So that the show really became a catalyst. This was, the curatorial was an important part of just sort of thinking and collaborating and convening and debating. And so this is Studio and a Black Study. Thank you. Thank you. It's 7.
Thank you. Given that it's 7 o'clock, everybody, and we had anticipated wrapping up, if somebody has one burning question, we'll take one burning question from Robert Miller, the director of our school.
Amazing. And was that Mario in your last shot?
That was Mario. Yes. Do you know? I know. Always, always styling. Mario's now our director. Actually, he's the director of architecture at GSAP. And sometimes collaborator. We have a lab called Global Africa Lab. I didn't show any of that work, but we do work through that as well. So great.
And
Thank you all for coming today.
thank you everybody for re-inaugurating a new tradition of actually being together in person once again.